our focus is really going to be on what we can call modern Africa. Africa from the late 19th century, that period, the 1900s. But we need some background. And Africa's history, of course, is extremely rich and long and deep and diverse. So I just want to give you some flash points, some interesting names and places and kingdoms and states that existed in Africa up to around the year 1800. Okay, so we're going to make a quick tour around the continent of some of the major state formations, the major societies on the continent. And when the colonialists and the Europeans came and took over the continent, they often denied that these states and societies existed. They basically said Africa had no history, and they said, these things are of insignificance. Like in South Africa under apartheid education, we didn't know that there were black people in this country, or that there were, great African societies, and people were sophisticated in terms of working metal, or in engaging in trade, or using currencies. Okay, so I don't want us to spend too much time with this because we've got a very short time, but I want to stimulate your interest in getting to understand the complexity, the diversity, and the richness of the continent. Let me first start with some of the major states. And I think I'll start with Ethiopia, with what is today Ethiopia. Now you know your map, and you know Ethiopia, even though Ethiopia, I don't think has ever played against Bafana Bafana. Okay, and they've of course beaten Bafana Bafana.
Yes. Yes. Going to.
Yeah. So,
We didn't go to
so Ethiopia is the modern name for a territory that used to be called Abyssinia. Okay, Abyssinia.
Coming from.
Okay. Yeah. So and Abyssinia in the earlier centuries had grown out of a great state called Aksum. And Aksum, the rulers of Aksum converted to Christianity already in the 4th century. If you are interested in this, we can talk more about it at another occasion. But they were Christian long before much of Europe was Christian. And their Christianity was derived from the Christianity that was practiced in Egypt. And it was called Coptic. So there's a connection between the Christian church of Abyssinia, of Aksum, and the church, the Christian church in Egypt. A long historic connection, and eventually there was a break between the two churches. But their churches are have their own hierarchy, their own calendar, so they don't have Christmas when the other churches have Christmas in Western Europe and so on. They have a different calendar. But they developed a great civilization in Abyssinia, which relied a lot on scripture and books and writing. So what we have in this corner of Africa is from very early on already a culture of writing, of books, of scholarship, of philosophy by the intellectuals of the Coptic Church. So don't let people tell you, no, we never had writing in Africa and it's all just Imbongis and so on. As great as the oral tradition is, we have had a long history, and Abyssinia is and the Aksum civilization. The language that they spoke, which you will know now already, the language that is spoken there, the dominant language is Amharic. But the Christian literature that they wrote in, their prayers and so on, was like an old form which they use only of Amharic, which they use only in the Christian literature for years.
Is that the language of?
Yeah, no, the Egyptians use Coptic. The Egyptian Christians use Coptic, the Coptic language. Now, Egypt eventually was conquered by, very early on, after the rise of Islam in Arabia. Not Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, the name Saudi Arabia is a modern name that only comes into being in 1920s. Okay. So it's just the Arabian Peninsula. At the time, the conquest, when let me just stick to Ethiopia. The Abyssinians in fact dominated this corner of Arabia. Okay, the Abyssinians threatened and occupied Yemen and into the Arabian Peninsula. This is a very narrow strait there. The Gulf of Aden. You must look at how much. You see, so this in many ways is part of African history. The Arabian Peninsula. It was dominated from the side. Okay, so don't only think Africans are all the time invaded and dominated from outside. Here we have these this society dominating and threatening the Arabian Peninsula. And their belief was that ultimately they will conquer Jerusalem. Okay? Now, what happened, however, is that with the rise of Islam in the 7th century, in the 600s, 632, thereabout AD, they conquered Egypt. Okay? And Egypt is eventually Islamized from the 700s. The Copts remain important. They remain an important factor, but the language eventually becomes Arabic, at least in the big settlements. Before the establishment of Cairo, you have a place called Fustat, and Fustat becomes Cairo. Cairo in Arabic is means Al-Qahira. That means Al-Qahira. Al-Qahira, which means to dominate, to almost like to oppress. So it was the dominant center. Okay. So this only comes into being in the 700s. But by the 900s, Egypt is a major power. 1000s, Egypt is a main power. And the word Egypt is a Greek word. Okay? Egyptos. The word is basically from Greek. The Arabic word is Misr. Okay. So what I'm doing here is basically giving you the connection between these places. Through the Coptic Church, the domination of Abyssinia in this region, Amharic as an important great language, the rise of Arabic from 700s in this. When the Arabs from the peninsula conquer Egypt, they also spread along the coast very far to what is today Morocco. Okay, so you have a spread there from in 700s, 800s they spread. Those places were dominated by the Greeks and the Romans, and even by the people from what is today Lebanon. The anyway, so what basically there is a fascinating mixture of things happening here in the Mediterranean with the Greeks and the Romans, and then the Arabs and Muslims and the Abyssinians going that way. What brings together the Egyptians and the Ethiopians, or what brings them together in friendship and in conflict, is the Nile. It's very important. The Nile has two branches. Do you know that, of course?
Yeah.
The White Nile and the Blue Nile. So the Blue Nile runs from Lake Tana, and now if you follow the news, there's a big conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia, because the Egyptians are dependent on the Nile. The Ethiopians are building a dam, and the dam will reduce the amount of water that flows to Egypt. And Egypt is very dependent on the Nile. Okay, so this we can, if you're interested at any point and you want any extra readings, we can look at that.